In the sermon today, I'm going to be telling you a bit of history that you might not know about. When I was at school, I used to think that history was the story of what happened. And in a sense it was up until about O grades. You learnt what had happened and you repeated that in the exams. But by the time I was doing my higher, the teaching of history had kind of changed. And the emphasis was much more about gathering evidence and weighing up the evidence and interpreting it. So the idea of what actually happened was revealed as being more elusive. In many ways, the interpretative exercise of trying to work out from the available evidence not only what might have happened, but more importantly, why people in the past may have done certain things, made the study of history more interesting and more exciting. You could tell different stories depending on how much weight you gave to each bit of evidence. What I'm going to tell you in the sermon takes several little bits of conflicting evidence and speculates around them. What I'm going to say is possible, but by no means definite. It offers a possible reason for an aspect of Christian belief which arguably has not been given the prominence it deserves. And it's possible that that has happened because all biblical reading is interpretation. We give prominence to parts which often we have been told deserve more prominence. But who has told us that? And why? Whose agendas are being served? I'll give you an example. Take the saying of Jesus, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's." You've probably heard that saying interpreted as an argument for fair division. Some things belong to the world, others to God. But that interpretation could be seen to be making Jesus into a collaborator with the Roman authorities, or at least not much of a threat to them. But what if he actually meant everything belongs to God and nothing belongs to Caesar? That would put quite a different complexion on that saying. What I'm trying to say is that a lot of biblical interpretation has favored the powerful and favored the status quo. A spiritual, otherworldly message has been emphasized because that's less disturbing. Promise has been interpreted as something to be fulfilled in the future, after this life, because fulfilling it now might be really disruptive to people who rather like the way things are right now. But more and more, the radical, revolutionary message of the Bible is being rediscovered. I'll be arguing that Mary's song, the Magnificat, is a manifesto against current injustice in her time and current injustice now for all who read it and take it seriously. That it is a text grounded in real experience not a vague promise of a distant, better future. As we gather round our biblical texts today, listen too for particular ideas in the words of the prophet Micah, words and ideas which echo words that we'll hear also from Mary. Feeding, security, and peace. And ask yourselves, why should anyone be content to wait indefinitely for any of these? Micah, too, is about change now. Not many people have heard of Sepphoris. You would struggle to find it on any modern map unless you looked for it under its modern name, Tsipori. It is little more than a village by our standards, though once it was considered to be an important city, a place particularly known for its learned scholars. In times of antiquity, it was thought to be the birthplace of Mary, the mother of Jesus. There's no evidence for that tradition, but neither is it impossible, because Sepphoris, or Tsipori, is just about 4 miles north of Nazareth, up into the hills. Accurate historical chronologies are very difficult to reconstruct at a distance of more than 2,000 years. As we've often observed, the Bible is not concerned with recording history in the way that we might understand recorded history. The Bible tells a story of divinity and humanity in dynamic relationship. It does so against a backdrop of historical events, but often these events are pressed into the service of the spiritual narrative, rather than related with an eye to what we would think of as verifiable historical accuracy. There is no way to reconcile secular historical accounts of events in, for example, Galilee over 2,000 years ago with the references to the characters and events in the Gospels. The Gospel writers had their agendas, and they shaped their stories around those agendas. Who was alive exactly when was of less importance to them than telling us stories about who Jesus was. The only significant secular written source for the history of Judah, Israel, and Galilee, covering the time of Jesus' life, was written by Josephus, who was a Jew who worked for the Roman imperial forces. He is the only near contemporary source outside of Christian writing to mention Jesus. The only one. And he mentions Jesus, I think, only once in passing in his history. Now, he too, of course, had his own agenda, namely to present the Roman authorities in a good light. His account overlaps, but cannot be fully reconciled with the Gospel accounts, which all, as we know, vary from one another in subtle ways. And neither Josephus nor the Gospels can be wholly supported by what has been found through archaeological excavations. Now, we are familiar with the name Herod. There are several Herods, but the one I'm talking about is the king who we read about in Matthew being visited by the Magi, the one who ordered the massacre of all the boys aged 2 and under in Bethlehem. Intriguingly, there's no mention of this horrific event in any of the other Gospels, nor indeed in Josephus. For Matthew's story to work, Herod had to be alive, at least until sometime after Jesus was born. But as we've noted before, Matthew's real interest is to link Jesus to the stories of Moses. And in this instance, he does so by this story of Jesus escaping infanticide. Because, of course, Moses was also similarly under threat. The Pharaoh had given a decree to kill all the baby Hebrew boys because he was afraid that the Hebrew nation was becoming too strong within Egypt. And, of course, Matthew also is the gospel writer who tells us about Jesus and Mary and Joseph fleeing into Egypt, that the Exodus, in a sense, might be repeated. So that's Matthew's interest, and that explains why Matthew emphasizes and has these stories in his gospel while others don't. But coming back to Herod, Josephus tells quite a different story. According to him, Herod died in 4 BC, the same year in which most people think that Jesus was born. Herod, a client king of the Romans, was never trusted by or popular with the people that he ruled. His vast building projects, including the huge expansion of the temple in Jerusalem, of which the western wall is the only remaining part, failed to endear him to his subjects, who saw his conversion to Judaism as political expediency, not authentically religious. There seems to be little doubt that Herod was cruel and murderous, but effective. He was, if you like, good at tyranny, and that's, I suspect, not an ambition that any of us would share. His death, according to Josephus, was greeted with violent uprisings. It was as if the lid had come off the pressure cooker. One of these uprisings took place in Sepphoris, and the Romans sent in legions from Syria to crush the rebellion. Josephus records that the city was burnt, its inhabitants raped, killed, or enslaved, and those who did manage to survive lost everything. If Josephus is right, and if his time scale is accurate, just 4 miles down the hill in the village of Nazareth, a young woman was pregnant at the time. Try to imagine the effect of this event, this burning of a neighboring village. Just 5 miles from here stands Gore Bridge. Imagine standing here in Dalkeith, looking up the hill, seeing thick black smoke filling the sky as Gorebridge was burnt to the ground. Imagine hearing the stories of terrified survivors who'd somehow managed to escape to Dalkeith. We would share their fear. We'd be terrified that our town was to be next. And I'm sure we'd be fleeing the violence we feared might come. It would be a traumatic experience, something that we would never, ever forget. It would affect the rest of our lives. And our telling and retelling of the story would affect the lives of generations to come. Now, thankfully for the good people of Gorebridge and for us, this is just an exercise in imagination. But the point is, it may help us to think our way into the political environment against which the Gospels are set, the political reality in which Jesus lived his life, because this was not a peaceful region. If Josephus is right, the destruction of Sepphoris would have been an event that Jesus knew about, would have known about all his life, something which would have affected his childhood as he heard the stories of this awful event told and retold, something too which may well have shaped his ministry. The Gospels never say that Jesus went to Sepphoris, a place only 4 miles from his childhood home, and yet they record him travelling to all sorts of other towns and villages over a wide area. Could that be significant? Could it be that the sack of Sepphoris was what made a young pregnant woman set out in haste to a Judean hill town far away from Galilee and stay for several months with her cousin? While some of this, of course, is speculation, what is beyond doubt is that Jesus was born into a situation in which the local population was being oppressed by an imperial power. One was weak and the other immensely strong. Acts of terrible brutality, like destroying towns, like crucifying people who posed a political threat, were committed to reinforce the message of overwhelming dominance. And if Jesus was born into a situation of oppression, he was also born into a situation in which the weak, the oppressed, were looking for a way to overcome the imperial power of Rome. And they believed that only by divine intervention could this be achieved. By the time the Gospels came to be written, small communities of Jesus' followers had come to believe that Jesus was God's intervention, that he was the fulfillment of divine promise to redeem them from Rome's brutal domination. The story we have read this morning about Mary visiting Elizabeth, and the text, the song which Luke ascribes to her, is about Mary's participation in the salvation of her people. She speaks against economic exploitation. of the local people by the Roman imperial powers. She speaks up for those who experienced poverty, hunger, and disease because of Roman rule. She longs for salvation, not in the future, but in the present. She demonstrates that God is concerned with the social and political realities of the daily lives of oppressed people. She affirms that God is on their side. She sings of God acting now. A frightened woman fleeing the Holocaust of a neighboring town, possibly her own birthplace, carries God's salvation within her. She's a partner with God in God's work of salvation. But that role belongs not just to Mary. All of us carry a spark of the divine within us. All of us may partner with God in God's work of salvation. Amen.